Here is something that should not be possible. A country has been in active military conflict for over 70 years. It has fought multiple full-scale wars, survived multiple economic crises, and in the last 2 years alone has been engaged in simultaneous military operations on several fronts: Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and the shadow war with Iran. By every conventional rule of economics, this country should be struggling. War destroys infrastructure. War drains budgets. War drives away investors and collapses consumer confidence. And yet, in 2023, while bombs were falling and hundreds of thousands of reservists were being called up, Israel's stock market gained 22%. Its GDP per capita stands at roughly $52,000, higher than Italy, higher than Japan, in line with some of the wealthiest nations in Western Europe. So the question isn't just interesting, it's genuinely strange. How does a country at permanent war become one of the richest in the world? And what does the answer reveal about how power, money, and survival actually work? To understand Israel's economy today, you have to understand what it was built on. When Israel was founded in 1948, it was immediately at war. 5 neighboring armies invaded within hours of independence being declared. The economy was agrarian, government-controlled, and almost entirely focused on survival. There was no time for long-term planning. Resources went to defense. Everything else waited. This pattern repeated itself for decades. The Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Each conflict drained resources, disrupted growth, and forced the country to make difficult choices about where to invest its limited capital. But something unexpected happened inside that pressure. Each war pushed Israel to develop military technology faster than it otherwise would have. And each time the conflict paused, the technology didn't disappear. It bled into the civilian economy. By the 1980s, Israel was facing a different kind of crisis. Inflation reached 450% annually. The economy was collapsing under the weight of decades of government control and military spending. It was at a breaking point, but also a turning point. The government responded with sweeping reforms: privatization, foreign investment incentives, tax breaks for technology companies, a deliberate pivot away from a state-controlled economy toward a market-driven one focused on high-tech industries. At the same time, something else happened that would permanently alter Israel's economic trajectory. The Soviet Union collapsed, and nearly 1 million highly educated Jewish immigrants, engineers, scientists, mathematicians, doctors, arrived in Israel within a few years. A country of 5 million people absorbed 1 million skilled professionals in less than a decade. The effect on the tech sector was transformative. Suddenly, Israel had the human capital to match its ambitions. The startup culture that emerged from that combination, military-driven innovation, reformed economic policy, and a sudden influx of technical talent, became the foundation of what the world would eventually call the startup nation. Here is the core of how Israel's economic model actually works, and it's unlike anything else in the world. In most countries, the military and the economy operate in parallel. Defense spending is a cost, necessary perhaps, but a drain on resources that could otherwise go to education, infrastructure, or healthcare. In Israel, the military is the economy, or at least it feeds directly into it. Nearly every Israeli citizen serves in the military. That alone is not unusual. Many countries have mandatory service. What is unusual is what happens during that service. Soldiers aren't just trained to fight. They're trained to operate some of the most advanced technology on Earth, to write code under pressure, to lead teams in complex environments, to solve problems where failure has fatal consequences. For those placed in elite intelligence units, most notably Unit 8200, Israel's equivalent of the NSA, the training goes even deeper. Cybersecurity, signal intelligence, data analysis at a scale that most civilians never encounter. When these soldiers leave the military, typically in their early 20s, they don't go home with a rifle and a handshake. They go home with skills that Silicon Valley pays hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to find. And in Israel, they're concentrated in a small country of 9 million people with a culture that actively pushes them toward entrepreneurship. The result is a pipeline. Military service produces technically sophisticated young people. Those people start companies. Those companies attract foreign investment. And the defense technology that started the whole chain gets commercialized, licensed, and exported to the world. Israel's cybersecurity sector, born almost entirely from military intelligence programs, generated over $11 billion in exports in 2023 alone. 3 of the world's top 40 defense companies are Israeli. The company is one of the largest arms exporters on the planet, in absolute terms, despite having a population smaller than New York City. This is the mechanism. Conflict doesn't drain the economy, it trains the workforce that drives it. But there's a factor that makes all of this possible, one that rarely appears in polite economic analysis. Since the late 1960s, the United States has provided Israel with over $318 billion in military and economic assistance. Last year alone, American aid to Israel amounted to well over half of total U.S. foreign aid globally. This number matters more than it might initially seem, because foreign aid isn't just money. It's a subsidy for choices. Every dollar the U.S. sends to Israel for military equipment is a dollar Israel doesn't have to pull from its domestic budget. That frees up capital that other countries in comparable security situations simply don't have. Capital that can go towards research and development, education, infrastructure, and the kind of long-term investment that builds a technology economy. Israel invests around 5% of its GDP in research and development. That's nearly twice the rate of the United States. It's one of the highest ratios in the world, and it's only sustainable because the military burden, which would otherwise crowd out that investment, is partially offset by American support. Beyond the money, there's the diplomatic dimension. American influence at the United Nations has repeatedly shielded Israel from sanctions and resolutions that could have caused tens of billions of dollars in economic damage. During the 2023 Gaza conflict, the U.S. blocked multiple efforts to impose economic penalties that were applied to other countries in comparable situations. This isn't a judgment about whether that prediction is right or wrong. It's an economic observation. Israel operates with a safety net that other nations don't have. And that safety net has allowed it to take risks, economic, military, and geopolitical, that would be catastrophic for a country without it. The combination of that external support and internal innovation created something genuinely rare. A small nation that turned its greatest liability, permanent insecurity, into its primary competitive advantage. But no model is invulnerable, and Israel's is showing strain. In the final quarter of 2023, as the Gaza conflict escalated, Israel's GDP contracted by 19.4% on an annualized basis. Consumer spending dropped 27%. Private investment, particularly in real estate and tech, fell by 70% as uncertainty made investors cautious. Around 18% of the workforce was disrupted by evacuations and military mobilization. The budget deficit, which sat at a manageable 4.6% of GDP before the conflict, is now projected to reach as high as 10%. Military operations are costing roughly $270 million per week. National debt is expected to rise from 60% to 67% of GDP by 2025. The government is simultaneously supporting 300,000 displaced civilians, funding active military operations on multiple fronts, and trying to maintain the social services that keep the public support intact. And here is where the model's deepest vulnerability appears. Israel's social contract, the unwritten agreement between the government and its citizens, has always rested on a specific bargain. We accept the burden of conflict, the military service, the security anxiety, the economic disruption. In return, the state delivers prosperity, world-class healthcare, technological opportunity, and a quality of life that makes the sacrifice feel worthwhile. That bargain holds as long as the prosperity side of the equation keeps delivering. But as military spending crowds out public investment, As deficits widen and austerity becomes harder to avoid, the equation starts to shift. Political pressures make it worse. To maintain his coalition, Prime Minister Netanyahu has protected subsidies for ultra-Orthodox communities, a population that largely does not serve in the military and has low labor force participation, even as defense spending rises and cuts are needed elsewhere. It's a political calculation that puts coalition survival above fiscal sustainability. And it's one that grows more expensive every month the conflict continues. So, back to the original question. Why hasn't war destroyed Israel's economy? The honest answer has three parts. First, Israel built a system where military investment and economic growth feed each other rather than competing. The army trains the workforce builds the companies generate the exports. The loop is self-reinforcing in a way that no other country has fully replicated. Second, Israel has had external support, financial, diplomatic, and strategic, that allowed it to sustain that model through decades of conflict that would have bankrupted a country operating alone. And third, Israel has consistently bet on human capital over natural resources. In a region sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on Earth, Israel built its wealth on engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs. That bet has paid off spectacularly, so far. But the cracks are real. The current conflict is the most financially costly in the country's history. The social contract is under pressure, and the political system is making decisions that prioritize short-term coalition stability over long-term fiscal health. Israel has survived every previous test. History suggests it probably survives this one too. The real question is what kind of economy it emerges with on the other side, and whether that model that made it rich can survive a conflict with no clear end in sight.